Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Snapshot and OT time presentation. The decade you're about to hear about is the 1920s to 1930s. A brief introduction to the presentation you're about to see on the 1920s to 1930s. You're going to hear about the world events, personalities, and also social movements that really shaped occupational therapy. And we are going to take a few steps back and talk about the years leading up to this decade.
Entering into the 1920s, the US was just emerging from a global pandemic, something that I'm sure we can all empathize with. In 1918, the H1N1 influenza, also known as the Spanish flu, ran rampant throughout the world. In the US alone, there were about 675,000 deaths, which we can compare to our current 433,000 deaths from COVID-19. The global pandemic caused a delay on the school started at Walter Reed, which had been formed to teach reconstruction aides about occupational therapy. Also, reconstruction aides often had to work as nursing aides throughout the pandemic rather than engage patients in therapeutic activities. This led to one of the goals of this decade, which was differentiating occupational therapy in the medical field and leaning away from the role of arts and crafts teachers that had become associated with occupational therapy during the arts and crafts movement. The Roaring Twenties was a time of increased consumerism in the early 20s, an age of prosperity and excess. It is most notably known for the prohibition and the increased popularity of jazz music. This era brought advancements in manufacturing, transportation, communication technologies, and medicine, most notably the creation of insulin and penicillin. Talking movies and radios were major forms of entertainment. In fact, I'm at the theater right now. In this period of economic prosperity, IOTA took the opportunity to search for funding for schools and sponsorship in the medical field. The Roaring Twenties came to a halt in 1929 when the stock market crashed and the US plunged into the Great Depression. The 20s also ushered in the civil rights movement and the advancements of women's rights. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and women gained the right to vote. While activists initiated women's rights to birth control and facilitated the distribution of contraception to women, flappers broke down barriers for women in numerous fields, including politics and economics. In occupational therapy, we see the advancement of women in the field, both as founders and practitioners. For example, Eleanor Slagle was the first woman president of IOTA from 1919 to 1920. And of course, one of the most important events of the time, World War I.
So I'm going to talk a bit about what occupational therapy stood for at the very beginning and how it was influenced by World War I. So during the early emergence of OT, it was considered the science of healing by occupation. And because we emerged in a time that aligned with the moral treatment movement to reform treatment of the mentally ill, what they called or crippled, a lot of occupational workers were originally seen in insane asylums. And they were also seen treating patients recovering from physical injuries and chronic conditions like tuberculosis. Then the US entered World War I. It was a brutally violent war that left soldiers in a state of shell shock, which impaired on their ability to reason, talk, sleep, or really anything related to their executive functioning. So that's when occupational workers were recruited for the job of reconstructing disabled soldiers. And these war training classes were quickly established for these civilian women who were teachers and artists, secretaries, who then became known as reconstruction aides. And they recognized that the forced idleness that the soldiers were going through during recovery was morally wrong, as well as mentally disorienting and physically debilitating. So they resourced arts and crafts as a treatment to engage injured and disabled soldiers in an occupation-based intervention during a time of physical, emotional, and mental agony. And you can just see this quote I put by Dr. Adolf Meyer, a psychiatrist and OT advocate, that beautifully states the unique way OT still approaches treatment today. And quickly, here are just some pictures of OT treatments in the 20s. So Dr. Meyer believed that soldiers could ward off their depression and gain self-confidence through occupations. So the reconstruction aides taught handcrafts as well as vocational skills to distract them, increase their physical activity, and raise the morale, which was very much needed. And other OT interventions in the 20s for curative workshops included things like habit training, handcrafts, woodworking, weaving, rug making, and recreational activities.
It's fascinating to learn about the foundations of our profession. I'm going to start with the Consolation House, which you can see pictured on the slide. In order to learn about how it came to be, it's important to know more about George Edward Barton. He initially renovated the Consolation House to have a more accessible environment. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1901. In 1912, his left foot froze and he developed gangrene. which required an amputation of 2 of his toes. He also developed a hysterical paralysis on his left side following surgery. While going through recovery, Barton became frustrated with his inability to perform easy tasks and certain aspects of the medical profession. This inspired him to do further research related to movement, how individuals could gain independence, and how they could get back to work after injury or disability. Barton analyzed the patient's current abilities, movement required for occupations, and the movement that should occur for patients to regain functional abilities. Barton also saw the significance in choosing an occupation that the patient liked, as well as analyzing the environment which the activity took place in. He was able to overcome his disability and was encouraged to show others how to do the same. This led to the creation of Consolation House, which had a garden and a workshop with a variety of tools. William Dutton and Eleanor Slagle discussed the possibility of creating a national organization for individuals working in occupational therapy so that they could share ideas and experiences. Shortly after, the first inaugural meeting of the National Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy took place with the founding members in the Consolation House. The founding members, whom you will learn more about, are also pictured on the slide. They wanted to differentiate themselves from craft organizations, so this society restricted membership to those with certain qualifications and knowledge so they could ensure the society had a therapeutic focus. On October 21st, 1921, the name of the organization was changed to the American Occupational Therapy Association. Their leadership helped to create the Industrial Rehabilitation Act and moving occupational therapy into hospitals.
So as mentioned, 6 of the 7 founders met at the Consolation House, and they're also in the background with me as well. So to start with Dr. Dutton, in the back left, he was a medical doctor that connected occupational therapy to medicine. He took over the presidency of AOTA after Barton and established the first journal of occupational therapy and wrote many books to spread the word about the profession. In the middle of the back row is Isabel Newton. She was the secretary of the association and later married George Barton. Lastly, in the back row is Thomas Kidner, and he had been the Canadian Vocational Secretary for their war hospitals. And for American Occupational Therapy, he described the scope of occupational therapy to focus on individualized treatment and preparing people to re-engage in their roles. The woman on the bottom left in white is Susan Johnson. She did not have a leadership position, but contributed to education as she taught occupational therapy at Columbia University and expanded practice areas to include chronic illness treatment. In the middle and the bottom is George Barton, and you already heard a lot about him and the Consolation House. He was additionally the first president of the association. And then on the end is Eleanor Clark Slagle. She worked at the Hull House and then held multiple positions for AOTA, including president, treasurer, and secretary. She created educational standards for occupational therapy programs in a nationwide qualified OT registry. The highest regarded honor for occupational therapy is the Eleanor Clark Slagle Lectures, which is held annually in her honor for her dedication to promoting the profession. Lastly, there is also Susan Tracy, who's not pictured as she did not attend the meeting, but is still considered a founder. She was a nurse who taught occupational therapy at several schools and published an OT textbook. There's also Herbert J. Hall, who was considered a near founder. He was a doctor that coined the term work cure, which you'll hear more from Sarah. He also wrote a book describing the benefits and how it could help his patients re-enter the world and workforce. You can also take this quiz to find out what founding OT you are. And then Adolf Meyer valued humanistic philosophy and viewed his patients through the holistic lens and believed in the power of doing to heal. Eleanor Clark Slagle is connected to the biomechanical approach that arose in the 1920s. It was originally used to analyze factory workers' movements and the effects on the work on their bodies to increase their efficiency and performance. This approach became the foundation for the activity analysis we know and do today. Together, they developed habit training. This approach provided institutionalized mental health patients with a schedule of ordinary activities for them to participate in to promote health.
Some of the founders that Heather just talked about helped to create guiding principles for the field of OT. Since its inception, the field of occupational therapy has had numerous articles, books, and creeds that have shaped the profession. Some early guiding principles came from Dutton's Principles of Occupational Therapy, his book Reconstruction Therapy, and the Pledge and Creed for Occupational Therapists. Dutton wrote the Principles of Occupational Therapy in 1918, and he read them at the second annual meeting of the National Society. It included 9 principles for occupational therapists. They included principles such as the work must be interesting, and it should have some useful end. There was a committee appointed to formally establish these principles, and there ended up being 15 total principles developed based off of Dutton's work. William Dutton also wrote Reconstruction Therapy a year later. There's a creed at the beginning of the book which starts out that occupation is as necessary to life as food and drink. Dutton then ends the creed with this statement, that sick minds, sick bodies, sick souls may be healed through occupation. And I thought that the whole creed, but especially these parts, were great descriptions of the importance of occupation. Reconstruction Therapy was highly regarded as a reference book, and it was one of the many times that Dutton articulated the power of occupation, which guided the formation of early occupational therapy. The Pledge and Creed for Occupational Therapists was adopted in 1926, and it has since been changed to the Occupational Therapy Code of Ethics, which was last updated in 2020, and is very pertinent to occupational therapists today. And if you have some free time, I would definitely recommend reading the first Pledge and Creed that is on the picture on the screen, and also behind me here, and then also reading the 2020 Occupational Therapy Code of Ethics and just looking at some of the themes and main points from both.
One of the first important professional development milestones of OT was the creation of the Archives of OT Journal, which was created in 1922 by the AOTA. It was an international periodical devoted to the promotion of OT and its relation to medicine, surgery, and handcrafts. While that stopped being written in 1924, in 1925, the AOTA introduced the Occupational Therapy and Rehabilitation Journal to replace it. The National Society for the Promotion of OT created two committees to create the qualifications for education in OT. The first committee was the Committee on Teaching Methods, which was led by Susan E. Tracy and looked into different methods to prepare outlines for teaching. The Committee on Admissions and Positions was led by Susan Cox Johnson, and they received all applications for admission to the society and presented them to the board. One important debate was whether or not OT should be provided by specially trained nurses or by expertise in crafts. Susan Cox Johnson believed that the war caused OT to become its own distinct specialty, and that because of this, we needed to train a new classification of worker with both medical knowledge and skill in crafts and teaching. The Committee on Education passed the minimum standards of training for OTs in 1923. In order to be admitted into an OT program, you needed to have a high school education or equivalent, and you needed to be at least 20 years old at graduation. The training program criteria included that they needed to be a minimum length of 12 months, which included 8 months of theoretical and practical work and a minimum of 3 months of supervised hospital practice training. These criteria were important because they wanted to make the program short enough that hospitals would be able to open OT departments, but also long enough that the departments would be able to train well-trained aides in that amount of time. The first important revision happened in 1927, which increased the practice training from 3 months to 6 months, and in 1930, the total length of the education program increased to 18 months, which included 9 months of theoretical and practical work and a minimum of 9 months of hospital practice training under supervision. One fun fact is that in 1920, the Mississippi School of OT was the first school to offer OT courses for African Americans.
The cultural artifact we chose to present within this decade is a book titled Occupational Therapy for Mentally and Nervously Ill. The book was published in 1925, and the image presented on the slide is an actual copy signed by the author on April 4th, 1925. This book was owned by Elizabeth U. Davis, an OT pioneer who established some major OT centers in Milwaukee and Delaware. Dr. Mullenhoff bought this book at an auction held by AOTA in 1992. She was generous enough to let us see the physical copy and take some pictures that are now displayed on the slide. During the time of World War, there were services performed by a therapeutic agency that became an interest to the public. The propaganda of this wartime press helped open up this large field to the public through the education of how occupational therapy can meet their needs, gaining popularity along with largely increased opportunities. A few chapters titles are presented on this slide, displaying how in-depth this book goes within the occupational therapy and how true their goals were. Within this book, there are images displayed of 4 plans developed for this building, shown at the top right corner, stating the structure is the backbone of the occupational therapy building. Arranging the available floor space into such rooms will meet their needs for therapeutic workshops and assigning different crafts, which require specific precautions, degrees of coordination, and any permitting noises. The book goes into specific details about a size of a room and what tasks will be done in each of those rooms. For example, knocking down an entire wall to create a larger space for crafts such as basket making, weaving, printing, bookbinding, and carpentry. It is written, it may seem like there wasn't a necessary amount of time taken for these simple basic principles that define the backbone of any plan for an occupational therapy building. Yet these basic principles cannot be made too clear and cannot be overemphasized. Architects and medical men collaborated on this building and the structural plan to make all of the proper accommodations and desires needed to be met. An example of a craft included in this book is a circular netting loom, which is pictured at the bottom left corner. Within this book, it goes into specifics of how to perform this task step by step. Overall, this book goes into great detail about how the building will be designed and what materials will be used, including how the floor plan will look and what rooms will contain what. The book is so precise in detail that it includes each craft the patients will partake in and how the patients can perform each of those crafts. Due to the amount of knowledge and preciseness needed to build an occupational therapy building, this book containing all of those details to make that happen resulted in being a significant artifact during this time.
So now just a quick summary of the presentation we presented to you today. The decade from 1920s to 1930s and the years leading up was truly a decade that forged the path for occupational therapy to come. Whether it was the world events that led to newfound changes in our profession, the people that really forged a path for us to come, or the newfound acceptance that came following a cascade of changes around the world, all had a huge impact on occupational therapy as a whole and what it would become. And just as a side note, please feel free to follow the link on our discussion board to take a short quiz to find out which founder you are. So, a thought-provoking question to bring us all home. How do you think occupational therapy would have found its place in the health profession if it were not for the popularization of Reconstruction aids? In other words, do you think we would have emerged as strongly if it were not for World War I? So we'll be looking out for your discussion board posts, and you can also see some of our references. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation on occupational therapy from 1920 to 1930.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you in the 30s.